We are continuing with our work today. We are going to have two sessions, basically. The idea behind these sessions and people who are listed here is that all give few words, let's say 7 up to maximum 10 minutes of introduction, saying some thoughts on the theme, which you can find in the program, and then we are going to discuss a little bit what Vedran said, what you all will say, and see if it's possible to come to some conclusion or not, which is also fine. The first part is dedicated to democracy within institutions, and we have today with us Nenad Markovic, yes. Who is coming from Skopje, from Law Faculty Justinian I. The title which you see here in agenda is slightly changed, so he will say a few words on Macedonian actually case and the perspective of supporting European Union in Macedonia. Then we have Claudiana Beshko from University of Tirana, Department of Political Sciences. I have to say that I'm really glad this is the first time that we have somebody from University of Tirana. Claudiana will say a few words about EU approach towards Western Balkans.
That was good.
Then Biljana Đorđević, our dear colleague here from the Faculty of Political Sciences, University of Belgrade. She will talk a little bit about when institutions co-opt all our democratic strength and imagination, which is quite the case here. And finally, in this session, before lunch, we have Luciana Lula, colleague from European University Tirana, to whom we already cooperated in a few, met in a few conferences, and we are really pleased to have her here. And she will talk about transforming political parties' discourse priorities in Western Balkans in the framework of the European Union accession. So after that, I would just like to say that we are going to have a lunch in the nearby restaurant Monument. You already signed for this in order to be quick as possible, because they are not usually quick if we do not order in advance. So, well, I would say thank you. I think that's good. So, thank you. So let's start with Nenad and to see what are we going to here today.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me so I don't have to do that. And basically this way of holding the microphone stimulates me more for karaoke than for a presentation. This is the first time I'll be speaking like this, but I'll try my best. So 7 minutes is really scarce. I'll try to speed up. Because I made a PowerPoint, and usually people that have a PowerPoint have no point, but I'll try to, and I'll try to defy that basically. So the new title, I don't know, I think it's in the new agenda, is called EU as a stabilizing factor in the Republic of Macedonia, ? Which is really missing in the text because it sounds a bit apologetic. This is more of a story about the loss and the regain on political leverage of the EU in the Republic of Macedonia and the potential for another loss of political leverage in the Republic of Macedonia. So it's a variation in loss if we use the terms that usually quantitative scientists use. So basically everything I will say is supported by quantitative indicators. Nothing is out of the blue and nothing is really improvised, but I don't have time to cite sources and to say what kind of... I really wanted a PowerPoint so you can all see the graphs, but I'll try to shorten it. So what happened to the Republic of Macedonia in the last decade or decade and a half for the ones that do not follow the process or just follow the process on a very shallow level, I would say. So basically, what happened was that Macedonia was a success story until 2008. It got its candidate status in 2005, and it went into rapid integration and legal EU harmonization after the conflict in 2001, and it was very frequently marked as the forerunner in the region for European integration. As I said, it got the candidate status in 2005, after which everything went wrong. There was a tipping point that I want to explain a little bit further in the presentation, which was called the Bucharest Summit of NATO in 2008, after which Macedonia went to a heavy political decline, but I will devote a separate chapter of my presentation to it. there is still a very high support for the EU. A very simple thing. However, this support 10 years ago was over 90%. Now it fell down to a few years ago to 66%, and then now it's a little bit over 70%, with ethnic Albanians being more supportive to the EU process than ethnic Macedonia, which is explained very easily. Is the name dispute, basically, where ethnic Macedonians see symbolical damage done to them, basically, through the name dispute degrees, to which they are forced, basically. So there is, if you ask ethnic Macedonians whether they would sacrifice the name for EU accession, then the majority of ethnic Macedonians would say no, if you put it in this kind of constellation. But then if you join the ethnic Albanian votes, it turns out that you have a very complicated situation. The majority of the biggest ethnic group in the country would not sacrifice the name for EU integration, but the majority of citizens would. So basically, it's a really, in a multi-ethnic society, it's a very complicated and puzzled story. As you know, negotiations with Greece are ongoing. As I found from one Social Democratic MP yesterday, they used to be my student, Tsipras is missing 10 MPs for a solution. But he's still missing 10 MPs. That's the bad news. It sounds that it's not much, but it is. So basically, the numbers follow this, what I previously said. In 2003, the support was 97%, fell to 66%, and now it's somewhere around 70-something%. Why do people support the European Union? It's something called utilitarian calculations. You know, there is this theory because of its symbolism, because political elites impose this process, and there is the utilitarian calculation. The Macedonian public, and this is across ethnic, religious, and every possible political line, supports the European integration process through the utilitarian economic lens, so they perceive some kind of material benefits from the EU. If you ask them which areas will be most positively affected, they would say economic development, then they would say decrease of unemployment, then quality of life, which are all utilitarian factors. So they don't, the other two factors have their influence, but to a lesser degree. However, there is no serious Eurosceptic energy in society. It's increasing, but it's nowhere near overpowering EU optimists. So let's speak in a relative plane, so to say, a relative political plane. There is Euroscepticism, but it's nowhere near gaining or becoming a dominant force. So the lack of significant Eurosceptic energy to a certain extent is a result of the social and political consensus on the importance of the process across ethnic lines. It's something that brings together all ethnic communities in the country. And it's additionally strengthened by the lack of a genuine public debate regarding the long-term implications of the integration process. So people don't know. They only see EU integration process through the islands of political benefits. Identity factors I already explained. There is a huge symbolic value to ethnic Macedonians of the name dispute. So it, of course, pretty much defines how public opinion is formed in the Republic of Macedonia, and it's the single most important variable when it comes to this process of European integration, because the whole process is withheld because of the name dispute. So it's kind of the core of the problem and probably of the answer to the EU conundrum. So I spoke about the loss of political leverage. It's fascinating how this happened in Macedonia. Greece vetoed the Republic of Macedonia in 2008 in Bucharest for accession to NATO because of the unresolved name dispute. And EU and NATO accession are always perceived in Macedonia as two connected processes because more or less they are. If you're vetoed into NATO, then you'll most probably be vetoed into EU, or most definitely will be vetoed for getting into EU. And EU was perceived as a completely impotent factor in the Republic of Macedonia, somebody that can completely not contribute in any way. Why? Because there is asymmetrical power relations between Greece and Macedonia. What Macedonia suffers is a real political damage, and is not going forward, and at the end it suffered a real state capture because of the loss of every possible hope for reintegration. And what Greece suffers is only reputational damage, which is not damage at all, basically. So this cannot be mended as long as there is veto power in the European Union, and really we cannot get out of this asymmetrical power. And it can happen to every country, to Albania, to Serbia, to Bosnia, depending on how good their relations with their neighbors are. So there was a complete loss of credibility of the EU, which was the lesser problem. The bigger problem was that domestic political elites, right conservative and their Albanian counterparts, used it as counter leverage for a very effective state capture. It was the perfect storm for them. I wouldn't say it was something they wanted, but sometimes I have the impression they latently did want this to happen, so they can use it as political counter leverage, and it was a political rhetoric that works perfectly in Southeast European societies. It's something that there is a magnetism to this discourse, and people kind of stick to this kind of rhetorics. So I wouldn't go, because we don't have the time, into the mechanisms of state capture. People in this country will probably are seeing and will see it for themselves. How does that look? And people in the region have seen in many examples, so state capture is nothing new. I would just say that civil sector, media, and judiciary are the most important spheres, and absolutely making a perfect network of clientelism and patrimonialism relations, which there is a political demand for, I must say. It's not always just the political supply. People want to avoid the question of political demand. There is a political demand for this kind of. So how did EU regain power? It was mostly the interplay between the United States, the EU, and domestic political elites through the Pershing process after, you all know, the wiretapping scandals in 2015. Until that point, it was always the stick and carrot politics. It was EU funds and bulldozer diplomacy by EU. EU was there to, EU was there usually, it was the Ohrid Framework Agreement, during the Law on the Territorial Organization, during the Maya Agreement in 2007, it's always the same pattern. EU would promise funds, and the United States would break some noses if needed on the domestic political scene. However, the Pershing process after the wiretapping scandals was completely different. EU stepped up, and USA deliberately let EU step up. So they changed roles. Many high representatives of the EU, including Johannes Hahn, were engaged directly in the process, and even 3 MEPs were brought to Macedonia to work with the parties, which was never done before. So the presence of the EU was very hard, and it was seen that EU is trying. For the first time, EU even made some direct political pressures. It was a role usually reserved for the United States. So, as I said, the USA intentionally gave the floor. After the change of government, which was a very hard and unpleasant process after the 27th of April 2017 and the unrest in the Macedonian Assembly, the name dispute was revived. So see, you must understand that this is a connected situation. As long as the name dispute is revived, and it comes in waves and comes and goes, then EU integration process is open up. Optimism among this Euro-optimists comes back at these waves of regaining ground for the name dispute, and it's kind of a political leverage seesaw. The less Euro-optimism and less chances for European integration, it's a very simple relation, basically. Then more skepticism rises in society, and then you have all the possibilities for a state capture by any possible political elite. The more it opens up, the more optimism rises, and people try to see it as a possibility. So, however, now there is a new danger in the negotiations with Greece. If the negotiations fail, I think that the NATO Bucharest summit in 2008 will be basically something minor compared to the possible disappointment and the possibilities for another state capture or another relapse, so to say, of Macedonian democracy. There is some hope for the name dispute. However, it's not very high. I was meeting Professor David Phillips from Columbia at the ASN conference in New York, and he asked me, should the United States send the big guns? And I said, you are already late. You're already late, because the name dispute is in a very complicated phase. So basically, if the name dispute fails, I'm really not very certain what's going to happen to the Republic of Macedonia in the long run. Political elites of ethnic Albanians are dissatisfied. They are already posting kind of a latent threat that they will try to go their own way if state failure occurs, or if name dispute failure occurs, which is just now on the level of some kind of a latent threat, but nobody knows how can that escalate. In general, at the moment, EU has regained ground significantly. 38.1 perception as an influential factor, and it has pushed out Russia as an influential factor. Russia fell from 6.2% to 33.7%. And especially, two more sentences, it's being perceived as the greatest ally of the Republic of Macedonia, which is also higher than last year, which is also regaining ground, and probably the most important thing, it's again perceived as a rule of law agent. So in 7 categories of a survey that I wrote with a colleague, they all regard rule of law. In all 7 categories, it is perceived as a positive factor in somewhere in between 56.2 and 58.2, which is rather high. So that's about it. If you have any question, we can discuss later. So please just note that the point of my presentation was this variation of leverage of EU and the factors that contribute. So basically now we are possibly challenged with a new variation in leverage, depending on what happens to the name dispute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nenad. I think this was really insightful. Let's go now to Claudiana.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. I would skip the first part of my presentation because of the lack of time. But as you can see from the title, I have divided the EU approach towards the Western Balkans in 3 phases. The first one goes from the 1990 to more or less the beginning of 2000. It's called the lessons learned. From that time, European community, which did fail to prevent the war in Yugoslavia, has always used this idea of lessons learned, trying not to make the same mistakes and everything. The second phase, learning by doing, goes from 2003 to the, in my opinion, to the inclusion of Bulgaria and Romania in the EU, which changed the things as long as these countries were not properly ready. We arrived at the third phase of come what may, which means that the EU learned from the mistakes of this enlargement, and in my opinion, it does not have clear ideas on how to include or how to integrate the Western Balkans. I will concentrate on the third phase, because it goes in line with the presentation of Vedran. It's like dragging in the ground all what he has said, and this is what I have done as a real political scientist. As I said, the real battle horse introduced from the EU towards the Western Balkans has been the idea. Now I'm talking about the third phase, the one come what may, has been the idea of the regional cooperation, which has been continuously repeated as a main condition to the Western Balkans since 2003. Under the Berlin process, this principle was translated into a good neighboring relations, or in zero problems with neighbors. In the Vienna summit in 2016, the Western Balkan countries were somehow incited to promise that they would not let the bilateral disputes obstacle each country's way to the EU. What happened next is a kind of opposite thing for this promise, a promise broken by the EU itself, which has conditioned the visa liberalization to Kosovo, and with the demarcation of the border with Montenegro. Another condition is also posed to Serbia, which will not be allowed to progress in the EU's integration if the relations with Kosovo will not be stabilized. According to signals coming time after time, you know better than I do, from representatives of Germany, Commissioner Hahn or Mogherini to Serbia's politicians. The lack of a time framework for the Western Balkans joining the EU seemed to be overcome by the strategy of February 2018. This strategy used to give some dates. It was 2025 or 2028 for the later countries. But this step forward will be soon discouraged by the EU Western Balkan Summit in Sofia on 17th of May 2018, where a clear time frame will be avoided. Some saw the strategy as a way forward, others as a bucket of cold water for the region. And in my opinion, the EU's approach towards the Western Balkan has been a kind of one step forward and 3 steps in standby. For example, all eyes are now on June's Council decision on the advance of the Western Balkan region towards the EU, which by calculation should be a step forward. Therefore, maybe there will be open some negotiations with some of the Western Balkan countries, maybe with Albania and Montenegro, or there will be given a candidate status to some others, but only in the framework of a political decision. And the citizens of the Western Balkans have the right to expect a political decision from the EU as soon as it has occurred before. We have a precedent, like a precedent example in this way. So. First, as the EU strategy of 1 step forward, 3 steps in standby towards the Western Balkans and the establishing of the stabilitycracy keeps going on in the region, some comments could be made. Of course, the first one may be explained with the European enlargement fatigue, and the second one with the need for border security rather than democracy. But in a period when liberal democracy is put into question by populism, negative consequences of globalism, and advanced capitalism, these are gaining more and more ground even in the Balkans. We can make a difference or a distinguished way from EU and the Western Balkan. The point is that while the Western liberal democracies are being transformed into post-democracies, those of the Western Balkan countries are skipping the phase of their consolidation, I mean the consolidation of democracy, by producing illiberal regimes, considering with this term formal liberal regimes with traditional parties, which are enriched with features of populism and authoritarianism. So, as a consequence, to make it shorter, we have populist or authoritarianist parties coming in power in some EU member states, or gaining more and more terrain, while in the Western Balkans we have another tendency. We have these traditional big parties transforming themselves slowly into such populist parties or authoritarian parties. Of course, in the way of the cartel party prescription. But this parallel different trend between the two realities should be repeatedly pointed out together with the different consequences it produces in order to make citizens aware about it. Second, there is another important feature of the EU approach towards the Western Balkans, the regional one, that should be analyzed with caution. The EU has been trying to transform the Balkan region ontologically, starting with its name, and dividing the Balkan region into sub-regions, as a Turkish scholar points out. He says that these sub-regions can be described from the one including Greece, Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia, as ex-Balkans, weird enough, now European countries, giving in this way the name Balkans, to the name Balkans, the connotation of the other. And Albania, Serbia, Kosovo, fear of Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Montenegro are actually the Western Balkans. And supposing that now the Eastern Balkan is Turkey. The problem is not with the consideration of the region as a region or as sub-regions, but with considering the Western Balkans as a bloc and putting them in a race between each other by measuring their performance or performativity in dates to enter, chapters to close, or homework to be done. This approach does not help, it only frustrates and make Western Balkan governments take pragmatic decisions only to fulfill tasks or give fast solutions only to be accepted by Brussels. These decisions or solutions may often be against public interest or citizens' interest, as time has shown. Third and most important, though the last reports of the Commission for each Western Balkan countries were published in April 2018 with suggestions and recommendations, they lack to address clearly the responsibility to the ruling elites, giving probably the wrong idea that the EU Council is going to welcome what may come out from the countries of the Western Balkans. All the 2018 reports, designed by the Commission for the Western Balkans, stated that corruption and capture of state were highly present in the region, while, strange enough, the door remained always open. So to put it in a blunt way, just to create the idea. On the other hand, all these reports stick to the youth cooperation and civil society, as if these sectors were the real responsible agents for the state of things. Yes, in my opinion, we know that EU integration has to do with the changing of mentality, and of course the inclusion of civil society and youth cooperation is important. But we have the reasons to strongly believe that EU should forcibly demand the changing of the political attitude of the political elites in the Western Balkans rather than the one of the civil society and youth cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamila. Thank you. I think it's really interesting that you say something about this focus on youth cooperation and civil society, which is obvious, at least in placing regional youth cooperation office in Tirana, which is very active for the moment. Okay, let's continue with Biljana.
Thank you. Well, I just realized I have the longest title, and it was supposed to save me sometimes setting the context for what I want to talk about. So I'm not going to talk much about how state institutions co-opt our democratic strengths and imagination. I'll just take this as a given. But in general, I have been thinking about this as a problem of post-democracy. But I mean, this is the theoretical concept that was developed for the Western liberal democracies. But since these new democracies of Western Balkans have transplanted this concept, so they basically inherited all the problems, and so of course post-democracy was here. But nowadays I'm more open to using the concept of comparatives, saying that, for instance, Serbia is competitive authoritarianism, especially after the last local elections. So I wouldn't even call it liberal democracy, because I don't think it's a democracy. But in general, I mean, this post-democratic problem, it is what is common for the social movements, civic initiatives, protests all over the world, as well as here. Of course, there in this region, of course, there are differences, but I'll start first with commonalities. So the issue is in basically resisting the politicization of basically all essentially political narratives that should be political narratives on public goods and citizen rights, so that in these different initiatives, when sometimes they emerge and constitute themselves as movements, the first thing is to resist, in a way to claim citizen rights that officially citizens do have, but that they are losing every day. And it's not just about, I mean, the major theme is social injustice and decline of social economic rights, but it's also decline of political rights. And that's why I don't think we can now talk about illiberal democracies, but about competitive authoritarianism. So in this sense, of course, the concept of citizenship is important because, as one political theorist, Sophia Nastrom, says, privatization of responsibility is the most apparent nowadays in the field of citizenship. In a way, what I want to link with the topic, the title of this panel, Democracy Within Institutions, is to think about how all these actors that in a way act outside of institution actually work within institution, because they contest them and they developed in contestation with institutions. I want to raise 3 questions, and giving a short amount of time, maybe some suggestions and my answers. Of course, I don't have time to elaborate all of them. So the first question is, how should we evaluate these movements in terms of asking when they are successful or when they fail? So the question is, what is the aim of these movements? And if we try to assess them as movements that should lead to a large-scale political change, we probably will say that all of them failed. Maybe Macedonian case will be different, but we will see what type of change this will be. But instead of this strong demand from this type of movements, and I think we should not look at them in that way because of this context of post-democracy. So we can't really expect that much because all these countries didn't have histories of democracies to develop. They inherited bad sides of democracy, but they didn't have the history to, in a way, inherit also the good sides. Some, for instance, institutions of disagreement, strong parliamentary opposition, or strong, relevant constitutional courts that we do not have. So instead of thinking about these movements as actors of political change now, we should think about them as possibility for a construction of a democratic subject, so of a demos that was not really there. So, of course, different cases in different countries have shown different ways and also successes or failure in constructing this type of democratic subject. I would think about this construction as a process where heterogeneous individual citizens and groups come together and transform private, what they think of private concerns into what they actually are, public concerns, political concerns, and through their collective resistance and struggle against common enemy for the common good, maybe articulate a political position and political democratic subject. This would be a successful story for me. Of course, even without that, many of these movements changed political climate, or we can evaluate them in terms of whether they changed or not political climate, culture that would allow in the future for the new political subject to emerge. So, for instance, when I'm comparing movements, protest in Serbia, so protest against dictatorship in 2017 after the presidential elections, it was a spontaneous protest, so it didn't have organizers, and in terms of constructing a democratic subject, nothing really happened after the protest. But what happened is that it politicized a lot of young people, and it created small initiatives, civic initiatives, some of them radical, some of them mainstream civic initiatives that they are small, but still they are changing the political climate, and they're having mutual interconnectedness and building solidarity networks. So in a way, there is something that to evaluate there besides some effective political change that did not happen. The second question is whether these movements should be interpreted as anti-systemic or systemic movements. Now, I find this particularly interesting theoretical question because from the constitutional point of view, when I think about emergence of demos, I think about demos as a constituent power. And constituent power from the perspective of the Constitution if the aim is to overcome the institution, because the constituent power should be the cause of polity and the author of the constitution. So from this perspective, emerging demos as a constituent power is always a dissident of the law. So by definition, it should be anti-systemic. But I mean, all of these movements, more or less, of course, they are heterogeneous, and there are different elements among them. Some of them are radical left, some of them not. But in general, the claims that linked all these people, groups, initiatives together were quite, how to say, within institutions. So the claims for rights that are officially recognized, the claims for public goods that are officially stated as political goals or constitutional aims. So in that sense, they are systemic movements. But I would say that it's interesting also to look from the perspective, not just from constitutionalism and constitution as a document from the normative point of view, as something that's ideal. And although many of these countries' constitutions have their drawbacks, still there are a lot of good rights asserted there. So there is something to fight for in these constitutions. But from the perspective of the governments, let's say from the democratic perspective, illegitimate governments, every protest and dissent, no matter how marginal it is treated as banal, irrelevant, or criminal, dangerous, and unpatriotic when it becomes, when it's perceived as something that is potentially dangerous for the government. So that has the potential to actually change something. So, for instance, I mean, this was used both in, let's say, sit-in protest in front of National Assembly of Montenegro, or every protest in Serbia, from the protests that were organized by the initiative Let's Not Belgrade Drown, but also protests against dictatorship, that after the protests, when they were happening, the government said that by the fact that they are allowed, it is shown that Serbia is a perfect democracy, but a couple of months later, picked and chose people, protesters, and claimed that they were organizers in order to intimidate any future protest from emerging. The interesting thing is, for instance, Asim Mujkic, in an article about Bosnian Spring and plenums, he said, plenums recognize the existing institution of parliamentary democracy, but demanded that they should be radically corrected, that they are not effective, that they are completely corrupted. But they recognize the existing institutions, so they are systemic movements in that sense. However, this is what I find interesting, he says that by the fact that these and I quote, archipelago of individual islands fail to transform into a uniform continent, so to establish actually a self-sustaining movement, unintentionally these protests or plenums could be considered as anti-systemic protests. So I find this interesting because, as I said, it depends how we interpret what is beyond institution, what is when you are a dissident of the law, when you are above the law, because there are many conceptions of citizenship and democracy that are actually based on the idea that citizens, when they are enacting, when they're demanding rights and enacting rights, they are transforming them. But from the perspective of the current governments, this is all criminal, dangerous, and unpatriotic. And finally, the third question is probably the most difficult question is, what are the sources of democratic legitimacy of these movements, especially if we understand legitimacy as the governments of these countries understand it, that it's based on procedural democracy, so the elections as a measure of legitimacy, especially in Serbia, which this is the measure that is continuously used every year to show that, to assert this legitimacy. And the sources of this movement, in a way, is self-authorization. So this in a way, can become very difficult and dangerous when the regime is creating its own counter people, counter demos. So this is in a way the struggle of numbers, who will have more people and basically the competition. And I will end with something that is, for me as a theorist of democracy, a difficult question for a constitution of democratic subject is who is the one who should recognize who is the proper demos, who is the proper people, and this problem of recognition, especially if the recognition should come from abroad, from international legislator, like in Macedonia, for instance, is something that is open and then has different potentials for these emerging movements. Thank you.
Thank you, Biljana. Some very important and long-lasting questions raised here. And finally, in this session, we have Lutiona Lula.
Thank you. It's my personal belief that once we talk about European Union, Belgrade is one of the most important cities actually for the region. And we can see even, it's interesting enough, and we can see even in the number of EU-related events here compared to what I see annually in Tirana. So I really like this kind of events. Today I will talk about if EU, and my thesis is that EU still has some transformative powers in Albania and Serbia in terms of especially electoral discourse, and I have taken into consideration the main parties in both countries. So why have I chosen political parties? Because especially in the countries of new democracies, political parties are important agents to see how the domestic politics has reshaped and has experienced changes. I have taken the Albanian case and the Serbian case and used a comparative approach from the rationalist camp perspective on the EU scholars debate by considering the concepts of conditionality, as we already know and we have discussed it here, leverage that deals with the influence of the European Union to the governments in the countries, and the linkage and so interconnections between the networks of EU and the Western Balkans, precisely here, Albania and Serbia. But what we know from literature is that in order for the EU conditionality to function well, it should have a straightforward credibility, commitment, and also not long-term in periods. So it should not be, the reward should not be very far from the moment you achieve. What happens in Albania since especially Thessaloniki summit, but also recently, in almost all parliamentary elections, the EU issue was never questioned. So in all electoral caucuses and debates, EU was present in all party discourses and party programs, and there was a consensus, and there still is in the political debates, that the Albania belongs to the European Union. Mainly, the main argument, especially after the fall of the communism, was that Albania was going to be part of the big family of EU, as we perceived that communism did an injustice to the country by putting it to the Eastern Bloc. So at this moment, we also see like a sort of value approach with the European Union. But interesting enough is that if you have parties that are pro-EU, and if you have a population that's very supportive pro-EU, then you expect to have a country that will progress more, especially Albania, that did not have the problems of Serbia and other regional countries, like state building or wars within the territory. Indeed, the question of EU actually has never been debated, and it has never had an informed public debate on EU. So it was always avoided in all electoral debates, and in the most interesting campaign the rest of the debates was mainly by three main political parties: the Socialist Party, Democratic Party, and Socialist Movement for Integration, which emerged in 2004 as a branch and then separate party from the Socialist Party. All discussions during elections were by accusing, as it is the general situation also in other countries. So there was never a real political debate on issues in Albania. But in 2013, what was interesting to see is that it was a premature phase of having a electoral political discourse on ideological issues. And the first ideological issue to be discussed was on taxation. So it was the first division between the left and the right, if the taxation should be flat or progressive. So the renewal program of the former and still current government was based on this 13 points of why the country should have progressive taxation, and on the other hand, the Democratic Party was and the opposition was pointing out the benefits of flat taxation, business, boosting business, and so on. So what we see in the case of Albania is that actually the leverage of EU was there only in moments of crisis. So almost all elections were not recognized by the opposition, and always the country has been, after elections, in the verge of political boycott and political backlashes. So that was the moment when the EU would intervene directly through the, mainly from the ambassador of EU in Tirana, and also US. They would always have the same position on that. So what we see is that the fact, the issue of EU itself, it has never been debated in public opinion and political party debates in Albania, but indirectly it has shaped and it has helped forming a party debate on other issues that has seen the kind of a formation of almost, well, fragile ideological camps in the country. On the other hand, in Serbia, from the perspective of the rationalist camps, until 2014, it was seen almost ideally as a perfect case where the rationalist theory of EU integration was adopted, at least in revising how the parties adapted their speech and agendas following the suggestions of EU. So EU, after the, especially when the Kosovo declared the self-declared independence and so on, the EU integration of Serbia was debated, but there was no concrete. As the same case of Albania, there was no concrete informed public debate during elections on EU issue itself. So it was only the case of should Serbia join the EU or not. On the contrary to Albania, when the issue of integration was not a question at all. So, and we see that Serbia would have been in literature reported as a success story of the rationalist approach, especially in the elections of 2014, when almost none, when none of the radical parties entered the parliament, and even though and with the fact that all other parties had changed their previous agendas and adopted to the EU regulations and recommendations, at least formally, because the gap between the speeches and what's being informal practices, it's not considered in this paper. So my main argument is actually that the EU, the EU rhetoric during elections in Albania and Serbia has had a power to transform the electoral debates focusing on domestic politics. So the transformative power of EU as an issue here is in the fact that actually it has enabled main political parties to focus then on more policy-oriented debate during elections for domestic policies, like economy issues, which are most important. But in the case of Serbia, this was also observed in the elections of 2016, when there was also the camp of economy issues and so on. So my argument is actually that even though the leverage of the EU, it's not the highest at the moment in the region, it still helps reshape the electoral debates in these countries by focusing and fostering domestic issues towards more policy-oriented debates. On the other hand, what's still problematic, as I mentioned, is the fact that there is still a gap between what's being discussed during elections and what actually the vote produces, because the electorate never predicts what the vote will produce, which is the baseline then for accountability, because you vote and in an ideal case you would know that your vote will produce such policies, and then you know who and how to hold accountable someone. So one of the issues that I've seen as problematic in both countries is the fact that the public opinion is not informed on concrete EU-related issues. So they know about EU, and especially in Albania, they perceive EU as a savior from all the problems, but there is no concrete information on how the EU works, what are the main structures. And I'm talking here about the general public opinion, not the scholars or academic premises. So how I think it, and one of possible solutions, if we talk and if we like to be more practical, is that we can raise the accountability, and the voters can hold accountable the elites by checking if they really complied with the electoral promises by providing them more information about the European Union and shaping this formed public debate in the countries. This could be by civil society, by academics, but it's a necessity observed in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nurtiola. I think you are quite right that the EU is used and abused in election rhetorics and debates in all countries. In Serbia, definitely it is. Now I would like to open the floor for discussion, basically for comments, questions, remarks which you might have for the panelists, but also for Vedran and in general on the topics which are raised. I think that there were some very, very interesting insights which we might hear here. The thing which crossed my mind when I was listening all of you is basically that we, in a way, see that there is, we all claim that we should approach to these countries in Western Balkans, which is seen as one block of the countries, as you rightfully mentioned, different because they are different in a way, and I'm not sure that is the case from the side of European Union at least. And from another side, there is reluctance for the moment or not of European Union due to internal issues, whether they as European Union institutions should deal with Western Balkans. And the recent summit which held in Sofia basically sent a very, very, very conflicting message in a way that yes, you're mostly welcome, but no, we have no idea when that will happen and what do you need to do in order to happen. So there is, in a way, very, very long distance promise that EU enlargement will happen again. But in my opinion, at least, I felt that as something which was really, really discouraging for the countries in the region which aspire to join EU, but in a way not to use European Union anymore as a reason why they are doing some things on internal in internal affairs. So, I mean, this is just something which crossed my mind when you were discussing whether we are left to our own and what we can do on our own without European Union in this case is really the question. I think that Macedonia is maybe the most affected for the moment because it's very directly linked to the European Union in a way that a member of the European Union is stopping everything because of the name dispute. And we still don't know what will happen, but
at the moment it's efficient. The effect is yet to come.
Yes, yes. But so, yeah, it's working okay.
Okay, thanks. Also first to introduce myself, I'm Sead Turčalo from the Faculty of Political Sciences, University of Sarajevo. I would like to thank Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory for organizing this event and having all of us here, and to thank all of the panelists for insightful presentations, and they gave us a lot of food for thought. What I would like is actually to ask Nena to expand a little bit on this symbolical and political fight over the name issue in Macedonia, and how this recent proposal is actually seen by the ordinary citizens. We are able to see what the opposition or opposition thinks about it, but how the ordinary citizens see this proposed name change, and is there emotionally loaded debate within the citizenship, or it's just something what's actually shaped and the entire agenda is set by this fact that the opposition in both countries, Greece and Macedonia, is strongly against the proposal.
No, you can just keep him. Yeah.
Thank you, Sead, for the question. It's really a long answer, so I'll try to sum it up in several good points. So basically, if anybody in this room thinks that you can explain to people social constructivism or ethno-symbolism or whichever school which is not primordial, you're in the grave danger of finishing as a very bad politician. So basically, don't raise your optimism when it comes to that. You can explain it to intellectuals probably, but people have their own gut feeling when it comes to ethnic identity. So basically, first of all, I would say that people in Macedonia generally have this emotional charge, and it's a rather polarizing question. If you look at it from the perspective of some kind of, I don't know, statistical frequencies, then I said what was I just pointed in my presentation the most important aspect. So basically, majority of Macedonians wouldn't compromise. It's not a big majority, but it's still a majority of Macedonians. I can check the numbers. I think it's 55 or something like that. They wouldn't make any compromise to get into the EU. So they wouldn't trade. Why? Because after the NATO summit, passive leverage, you know, the concept of passive and active leverage, and Schimmelpfennig, Sedlmayr, Vahudova, and all the others, is gone. So basically, don't count on the passive leverage of the EU. And that's food for thought for the Eurocrats as well, you know, and people coming from the countries of the European Union. Active leverage is still functioning. However, on the level of the whole country, if we apply what Biljana said, demos instead of ethnos, which is an equally important concept, I would say, it's always an interplay between the two, then majority of the people want to make a compromise. But there are levels of the compromise. What is the problem with making the compromise? It's a moving target all the time. So Greece is moving the target all the time. We cannot really stabilize what exactly Greece wants. It used to be something in the 90s and then something else in the 2000s, and now it's something completely different. And not even for the... so there are several possibilities of resolving the issue. Zaev is making an enormous effort as a prime minister with the huge risk of being a one-issue government. So basically, according to my political perception, he's risking too much with putting all his eggs into one basket. However, the name dispute, being a very polarized and very sentimental issue, social networks are literally crowded with hate speech on both sides, I would say. People that do it, people that don't want to make a compromise. There is no middle ground. There is no rationalization of the positions both of Greece and Macedonia. But aside from them, Zaev is really making an effort. There was the latest options for the name dispute were Upper Macedonia, Gorna Macedonia, Nova Macedonia, or New Macedonia, and Ilindenska Macedonia, which is the famous anti-Ottoman uprising. What I didn't previously say, sorry for the small digression, is that in fact it also creates an inter-ethnic tension, because ethnic Albanians are not direct stakeholders. They are not direct stakeholders. Although in public opinion polls, they support the Macedonian side in a vast majority. If you ask them, okay, who is to be blamed for the name dispute, Greece or Macedonia? A vast majority supports the Macedonian side, but anyhow they're not direct stakeholders, so it complicates the whole situation. The latest package was Ilindenska Macedonia, with the name staying, or the name of the language staying Macedonian language, country code staying MK and MKD, and citizenship, citizens of the Ilinden Republic of Macedonia. And Tsipras and Zaev had an agreement to push that through. But several professors that I contact from Greece, from ELIAMEP and other organizations, said that Tsipras chickened out, literally. Plus he's missing 10 MPs. So basically now, 10 MPs. He's missing 10 MPs to have the majority to push through in the Greek parliament the solution. And Tsipras. I know that Macedonian political elites promised a referendum. I'm not sure about Tsipras. Probably did. If a referendum goes out, it will not pass. All public opinion polls say that it won't pass. ELIAMEP published opinion polls. Greek public is absolutely 71% anti, including the word Macedonia in the name of the country, which is a compromise that we cannot make. It goes below any human dignity for the Macedonian side of making a compromise where we exclude the name Macedonia. So basically this Ilindenska Macedonia was a sure package, turned out not to be so sure. So basically now we're in a limbo. Dimitrov went to New York, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, went to New York. The government seems determined, but what I'm not so worried about the name dispute as the name dispute. As our colleague from Albania said, we are used to this one step forward, three steps hiatus, basically, in the EU accession policy, but the after effects. Me and a colleague of mine, a political analyst called Albert Musli, we were invited by the German and Austrian Ministry of Defense in Vienna to develop scenarios, and we had the ungrateful task of developing the worst case scenario. So basically, there is a worst case scenario, and anything apart from solving the name dispute will initiate such a scenario. So basically, now we're waiting to see whether a new impulse will come, because obviously EU diplomacy and US diplomacy will not pull the big guns out, because Macedonia is, let's be honest, the 72nd priority on the agenda of the EU, which has Brexit, which has Poland, which has Hungary, which has a ton of problems. So basically, it remains to be seen in the following few months until fall, probably this year, we'll know what will happen. But then I'm mostly worried about internal political processes. There is always a political demand for authoritarianism in our society. Don't always blame political actors for supplying that demand. They're just responding to what the political supply wants. So I think that a regime like the one that Gruevski installed can be easily restated. Now with the unknown variable of how Albanian political actors will react if the name dispute is not solved.
Thank you. We have a line of people waiting for the moment. We have Ursula, then Professor Jovic, Jelena, Valida, Filip, Sasha. So Ursula, please.
Okay, then I will try to put it very briefly. First, thank you for interesting insights in different aspects. And please forgive me because I'm not a scholar, I'm maybe something of a political engineer, something like that. Better now? Okay. And I was a co-worker in one of the factions of the European Parliament in Brussels when Spain and Portugal joined. Therefore, I remember some very optimistic days. Two brief questions. The first is about the definition of a political party. Because what I see here in the region and in some countries, these La France en Marche, President Macron or Prime Minister Kurz, I don't think these are political parties. This is some franchise organizations for state capture. Therefore, what kind of political parties are we talking about? And the second is about the leverage of the European Union. Of course, in some context, we are living on different sides of the river, but I remember very well this discussion for the elections in Serbia in 2008. And one of the stories is that the interference that the European Union helped a discredited government of the Democratic Party to survive. Therefore, this is the question, what kind of leverage is really useful in a mid and long-term perspective? Because what I learned about the European, when the European Union was founded, that it was never clear what it is, but it has never been an invading army. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Jovic.
Yeah, thank you. I think this Macedonian situation in a way requests further and I think more serious theoretical debate on the character of democracy and whether democracy is always a solution for everything. And when I say this, of course, I know this is highly challenging idea, but as soon as you involve people into making decisions of that magnitude, you open up yourself to a risk that there could be no solution then. And I think, unfortunately, we in the so-called Western Balkans had this experience with 1991, in which the involvement of the people in various referenda actually contributed to the war, not to peace. And we also had, on the contrary, experience where people were not involved, and we had a peaceful disintegration in cases of, for example, Czechoslovakia. And we also had a case in which a nation changed the name without people being involved, with no problems. And this is, of course, with Muslims into Bosniaks. So that was a change of a nation, of the name of a nation, which was done without referendum, without people being involved, and yet successfully and peacefully. And speaking of democracy in general, I really liked what Biljana said earlier, but I think also we need to bear in mind that there are certain dangers for liberal character of democracy with various NGO initiatives that come from ultra-conservative, theocratically inspired groups in a society who are using referenda as an instrument of reducing individual rights and rights of minorities. I come from Croatia, so, for example, I mean, if you follow Croatian politics, but also, I suppose, some other, Slovenia and some other EU countries, you would know what I'm talking about. That is, for example, that now you have an initiative for a referendum that would dramatically reduce equality between representatives of minorities and ethnic majorities in the country. And there will be another one probably about various other things, anti-abortion, anti-modernity, and so on and so forth. So I really don't know what to do with all this. But we need to take this issue quite seriously, because it seems to me that the fact that something is democratic doesn't necessarily mean that it's either progressive or peace-orientated or liberal-orientated towards individual rights. And now or rational. And now as I'm speaking, I think it's good that we are in this institute in particular, which is for philosophy and social theory, because we really have now, I think I have a problem with concepts we are using, which seem to be equally complicated as the concept of democracy. Yeah. So, for example, the Western Balkans and Europe in general, I see it more complex than just, what we usually think. Western Balkans as such. In fact, if you look, for example, public opinion polls, you would see huge differences between Albanian Western Balkans and Slavonic Western Balkans, and I think in particular Serb Western Balkans. Serbs in Western Balkans seem to be rather skeptical or negative about the EU. Albanians, very enthusiastic. Now, why? I think this has to do with their own personal memories of the 1990s and Western interventionism in favor or against them in the 1990s. And Croats tend to be similar to Serbs on this issue. Let me just remind you that, for example, a majority of the Croats did not really vote actively for EU. So they either were EU indifferent or many of them also skeptical. So, do we really have Western Balkans if we define, for example, Western Balkans as the waiting room for the EU, where everyone is transforming its societies towards the EU? And when it comes to Europe, and I'll finish with that, in Europe, I think what we see, and I like what Vedran said about this Vučić-Orban close cooperation. I think what we see in Europe is the core countries, and then internal periphery, and then external periphery, and then external actors. So Europe looks like the onion at the moment, really, like with 4 circles. Some overlapping, but mentally not. So what I see now is a cooperation between, and similarities between internal periphery and external periphery. So for example, Poland and Croatia, in many ways, are similar to Serbia and Montenegro. Yeah? And the difference between Vučić and Orban is not that great. And they both seem to have a problem with core countries, and they're to a degree playing, walking a walk, but not talking a talk, but not walking a walk when it comes to all this. And they're introducing Christian democracy and that sort of, or whatever, traditionalist democracy and so on and so forth. So I think it's more complex. That's all I wanted to say. But in particular, if anyone can refer to this issue of democracy in general, I mean, if you say all this, what I said, I mean, people would think you are a supporter of authoritarianism. Well, I'm not. But we need some clarity, at least in this environment here, right?
Thank you. Yellen?
Vilja wants to answer. Maybe Vilja wants to answer.
Well, we have a line of people already.
Okay, sorry.
Let's try to.
But that's not important. Well, speaking of democracy, yeah.
In the end, it will come.
Yeah. I just have a couple of brief comments. I want to welcome Biljana's intervention and proposal to call this regime a competitive authoritarianism and to ditch illiberal democracy, because it does seem like a contradiction in terms. And I think that we should not dissociate formal and substantive features of democracies. So that we should have, because the language we use, the terms we use or refuse to use may help or not help us to really understand the realities we live in. But I also want to connect 2 things that Biljana and Vedran said. Biljana was talking about new protest movements and this ambiguity about whether they work within or with institutions or outside institutions, and that in a way I want to connect this with something that Vedran, or to my contestation of something that Vedran said, that we're also witnessing the rise of a strong state, and the disciplinary measures that the emerging intensifying role of the state. I don't really think that's the case. That's not really the feature of new authoritarianism. It's actually that we have this ambiguous situation where state is alternatively present or absent. So we have many cases where state institutions are not there, they're not present, and then we don't really, and this is how authoritarianism plays itself. We had this, and some anthropologists and others have pointed out this very well, especially Stef Jansen in Bosnia, where state is not present and citizens are still making claims towards state, and they want to be seen by the state and by the state institutions, and they still make their citizens' claims in sort of an old way, but state institutions are not really there, and some other forms of political power are taking in the place of the state. Or, for example, during the peak of the refugee crisis in Serbia, where the state had the agenda, the state was pursuing the agenda, but was not there with its own institutions, but some NGOs or self-organized citizens stepped in, and even though they were criticizing or they were against, I'm talking about NGOs and citizens and self-organized citizens, even though they were against the state's response to the crisis, they were perceived or they acted paradoxically and maybe unwillingly in the name of the state, you know, so there was this paradoxical situation, and refugees themselves saw them as the hand of the state, you know. So there was a paradoxical situation when they stepped into, they all launched a hunger strike, refusing the food that was handed out to them, not by the state institutions, but by some self-organized organizations. So some just wanted to point out to this very paradoxical situation when we have present and absent state, and actually this is one of the ways in which authoritarian tendencies are playing out in our societies. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Jelena. Valida?
I have just a short comment to Biljana's paper. You mentioned the plenums in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I just want you to have this in mind, and this is something that we are trying to analyze and to understand, this really ambiguous and complicated role of civil society organizations that compromised actually all these plenum movements because they wanted actually to They came to articulate something that was from the people, and at the end I can tell you that somehow they contributed to the fall of these movements, because they had their agenda that was hidden agenda in order to take from the people the project of the plenums. So it's really interesting. It's not something that is oftenly stressed out. It was we were always talking about spinning plenums from the part of institutions and political parties. I will talk tomorrow about ambiguous role of left political parties that were not supportive to the people who were for the first time in whole Bosnia articulating the question of the class and not of ethnic relations. But we have this ambiguous and really suspicious role of not all, but some of civil society organizations who really helped to come to an end for this great thing that was happening in 2014. Actually, just to have in mind this, it's really interesting to look at. We just wanted to capitalize because the most of the civil society organizations actually were doing the business with all these projects and so on, and they wanted just to make some other great project that that they will use for the business project purposes. And unfortunately, many of them actually now became part of prominent nationalistic parties or other parties, really leaders of civil society organizations. So this is something that is not analyzed, but it's really interesting to look at.
Thank you, Valida. Philip?
Well,
and then Sash.
we don't have much time, I'll be just brief. I have one question to Nena. You mentioned the name dispute, but what about dispute about the character of the state in Macedonia? How is this affecting the political processes and democratic consolidation in general? Thanks.
Okay, I will leave that for, and Sasha is the next one.
Do we still have the time or not?
Yes, we have 20 more minutes.
Ah, great.
But not for you only. Not for you only.
No. I don't want to be the one who killed the Bambi, like, you know, like the last. My question is about, we talk about here about paradoxes. Why are Serbs not so eager to join the EU? There is some rationality, there is some irrationality. We could talk about that a lot. My question is about Albania. There is this huge support towards the EU, and yet Albanians are, if you compare the data, the country in the Western Balkans where most people, just go to the EU. Maybe that blends together. So most people believe in the EU, which can be seen as that young people kind of have, positive view of the future, but still 50, 60, 70,000 every year, go abroad. So what does that tell us? Do you think that maybe Albania is experiencing some kind of pro-EU renaissance, and once you have this 5, 6, 7, 10 years maybe of this enthusiasm, enthusiastic feeling that something will be great, and people will actually realize that they are, most of them are working in poor conditions for meager salaries, and that EU is one big, a fairy tale for a few privileged rich people. I'm pushing my arguments too much, but that's basically my question.
I would ask you just to keep the question, and Jovana, to your neighbor.
I liked very much Dejan Jovic's intervention in the sense of complicating the discussion, and I would like to complicate it a little bit even more. We are actually not talking about, for me, a big elephant in the room, and that is the specific type of neoliberal capitalism that exists in the Western Balkans, which is not really neoliberal or liberal or hardly new in a sense, but it is a form of capitalism where political parties which are controlling political system are in many ways overlapping or controlling or directing what seems to be capitalistic relations, but are probably something in between monopoles, oligopoles, and privatization of public resources and part of economy that is supposed to be in public good. So I would like to open up discussion how this specific economic constellation is basically corrupting media integrity, which is obviously through, nowadays media are corrupted not really by political oppression, but by economic unsustainability, which is basically much more effective regarding the really freedom of the speech and space for public debate. And again, how these economic relations are corrupting what we call as activist citizenship, or what we think citizenship should be in democratic society. So how citizens who want to be engaged and activists turn out to be very corruptible because of economic situation. I'm pretty sure that many NGO leaders in Bosnia and Herzegovina are not joining these ethno-political parties because they all of a sudden became awakened Bosniaks or Serbs, but because this is this is one of the ways of viably survive in Bosnia. And so to think about the lived experience of citizens through economic lens and how it influences their lived political experience.
Thank you very much, Biljana.
I wanted to say something about democracy. I mean, the way I understand it, of course, it's very complicated. I'm a political theorist, and there are different theories of democracy, but I don't understand democracy just as something that people do, so what people do, and this is democracy. Because then we come to the problem, who are the people, and then this is a problem that's logically unsolvable, because there's always somebody to authorize who are the people, and he never has authorization for that. So it's a constant illegitimacy problem. For me, democracy is the way to reconstitute people, and to legitimize it. So it's always there is always lack of legitimacy when it comes to people. That's why I said the last issue I was talking about is the most difficult of the legitimacy, both of social movements and the government and the people and all these social constructs. And of course, it is dangerous then to think about something. I mean, it requires a lot of time to disentangle things like referendums, whether they are democratic. So who controls them? It's always the party who controls them. So they are very often not democratic. They are understood as a method of direct democracy, but actually this is not what they're not really that. And also the second thing is whether, if we don't understand, if I don't understand at least, democracy is just a procedure, so it has some other values within it. So there are some procedures, of course, you have to come to some decision, but it also should enact some values. And it's also interesting then whether we connect democracy with social emancipation, which is something I think all these movements are doing. That's why they are, from my point of view, that's why they are democratic, because they understand democracy as enacting equality, and equality is both political and economic and socio-economic, so radical idea of equality. In that sense, then we can assess these other movements, right-wing movements that are actually denying equality to other people as not democratic. Of course, it doesn't mean that we should not take this claim seriously, and sometimes people project their anger because of lack of their treatment as equal persons, and they scapegoating others, and in that sense, of course, I think we should always be careful to analyze people's claims, but I think there are some resources to make these distinctions. What is democratic, what is not democratic. And also, I think it is really important point that Dejan Jovic said about cases where people were excluded and we had peaceful solutions. And I think, of course, it's fine. There are some decisions that should not, maybe, peace sometimes is more important than democracy. But if this exclusions comes with inclusion in all other important questions, I'm fine with that. But if people are absolutely excluded from everything, then they want inclusion in these type of symbolic questions, and then it becomes explosive.
Just that Nenad?
No, I'll go last because I have one chance already. I have a question to Vedran. What is the intention of European Union? A risk for democracy and dangers for society by stabilocracy. Stabilocracy, it seems, is very important from the perspective European Union. Thank you.
Okay, I have, for the moment, there are 3 questions raised, one for Albanian representatives, for Vedran and for Nenad, and I think answering those 3 questions, we will close this session and continue after lunch. So yes, you may. Yes.
Okay. I think we all agree that the post-democracy period in the Western Balkans is different from the post-democracy in the EU countries. I mean, it cannot even be named post-democracy as long as democracy has never been stabilized and consolidated in the Western Balkans. In democracy, liberal democracy, as we know it, the rule of law, juridical independence, etc. Meanwhile, neoliberalism is being questioned in the EU reality, while neoliberalist measures are being asked to be applied in the region of the Western Balkans. So this is what I'm working on, and I'm doing researches in order to show these paradoxes of the EU towards the Western Balkans and make aware of the EU's politicians towards this region. For example, in the summit of Paris in 2000, in the last one, during the Berlin process, it was all the Western Balkans were asked to build common market. A common market institution as the one that was present in the EU, but for example, the unique act which established the common market in the EU is of the 70s, and now it seems that the building of a unique trade organization without presenting true protectionist measures which can preserve some national goods from the competition seems as it is it's an idea, a very old idea in the EU reality. A very old idea if we want to transport it to the Western Balkans reality. So there is all this criticism about liberal democracy and neoliberalism in the EU's reality, member states. Meanwhile, they are trying to transport all these things they are criticizing in the Western Balkans reality. I found very, very interesting the idea of a referendum to reduce, used in the sense to reduce the quality of democracy. But I think nowadays the referendum are happening in a period of social networking, of this, how to say, it has to do with the kind of propaganda which is present nowadays, and if we are not aware of this propaganda made in the social media, which is really affecting people, referendums will yes, may cause this reduction of liberal democracy consolidation. This was my comment.
Okay, and answer? John or you, whatever. Yeah.
I'll start from the question of Sasha. There is support in Albania towards EU for several reasons. One can argue about the idea that how EU was promoted, especially after the fall of communism, as a return to the basic family of values of the Albanians and correct the injustice that has been done by the communist regime. And this has been the motto, like the main motto among population is like, let's make Albania like the rest of Europe. This has been the motto used widely for the first year of transition. There is also one could argue that the political elites are actually using the EU also as a tool to promote a certain idea of a greater Albania within the European Union, which means they in order to capture also the votes of nationalists, they proclaim, and this has been seen from the Democratic Party and also from former leader Sali Berisha and also from the current Edi Rama Prime Minister, that Albanians will join under the flag of European Union, which means we won't go for a common state of Albania and Kosovo, but actually we will join under the European Union flag. Other reasons could also be pragmatic, but I still keep to the idea of the lack of information what EU actually is. I really doubt that Albanian citizens have real information of what EU stands for, the values, duties, obligations that the member states have, and so on. I really think this is one of the main reasons. The issue of youth brain drain mainly and migration could be related to how domestic politics are being developed currently in Albania, and the fact that youth unemployment is decreasing, the economy is mainly currently focused on informal economy, and the alternatives for young people are not very bright. So an education abroad or even a job abroad are seen as better than one offered in Albania. But I don't think it is directly related to the fact that Albanians in polls are seen as EU enthusiasts. It's more of they see migration as the only way out, especially if they come from other cities rather than Tirana. So this is more for economic reasons. And here I would like to reply to a point that Ursula actually raised about the political parties. If it's concrete for my research, I use parliamentary political parties in Albania and Serbia, which mean those who pass the threshold, formally registered, and all this. So this is the concept I have used in my research. As for the leverage of EU and what level of leverage is useful, there is a caution to be raised here, in my opinion, about a formal EU leverage and procedural one, and the real how the real processes are ongoing in the Western Balkans. And the most recent and the hit one is reconciliation, and we have seen it with Western Balkan Fund, RICO, or Berlin process. But what I see here is that the leverage of EU has been high in imposing the reconciliation and so on, but I am afraid and I am skeptic if this reconciliation process actually is really being promoted on the grounds of really knowing the neighbor. I really hope it is not the case, as democracy was promoted after fall of the regimes. So the opportunists could be in the positions they are now, and we are in the situation we are. So I hope the same scenario does not repeat for reconciliation also. So this is one of the biggest concerns. And we could see here that EU leverage is actually high. They promote reconciliation and good neighbors, but at what extent really these initiatives are being controlled, if really they are going well, or is it just to receive the funds? Is it just to make some seminars and so on? It is for a fact that being part of Yugoslavia and being in a very isolated regime, such as the former one in Albania, has created differences. Even if you take, for example, Albanians in Albania and those in Kosovo, when I was living in Zagreb, it took me months to understand the joke about the bakery. About Albania, I was like, why people are laughing at the bakery thing? And because there is a joke that each Albanian family owns a bakery, and I was like, what? The famous bakeries in Tirana are German bakeries and German bread. So you could see here the cultural differences, and I really hope that this formal EU leverage and all these funds are not going to be seen as an opportunity in the case of reconciliation, at least. And sorry for bringing up a new topic, but it's somehow related to how the processes go. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's now have Vedran and Nenad very briefly.
Just a sentence on stabilitocracy. I mean, I would rather go into more of complexity following Yelena's and your comments, but this is something that we can take up probably in the afternoon and tomorrow about the economic issues, etc., and strong state, not strong state, etc. But on stabilitocracy, just quickly, I mean, and I'm going to quote, and this is really a speech that you should read, the Orban speech from the inauguration from the 10th of May. I'm going just to quote something to underline my argument. I mean, the birthplace of a real and final materialized birthplace of stabilitocracy, not only towards the Western Balkans, but as a general concept within the boundaries of the European Union, was the so-called migration and refugee crisis 2015. And now listen just to Orban, and he is seems to be a forethinker of this kind of a concept. So migration. Quoting, I'm convinced that migration eventually leads to the disintegration of nations and states. National languages weaken, borders became blurred, national cultures dissolve, and what remains is a single open society. Finally, the merging of European societies makes such headway that a single unified European government can come into being. This is the fate that awaits those who fail to defend themselves against migration. Perhaps not tomorrow, but within the foreseeable future. This is the name of the game. This is a true master plan. I will not conceal our intentions. Here before you, I am making it clear that acting in the name of Hungarian freedom, my government will be a determined opponent of this plan. The process that has led here and its intermediate steps. Multiculturalism was the first such step. Political correctness, which muzzles freedom of speech, was the second. This is where Europe stands today. The third step would be the mandatory migrant resettlement quotas. We must and we will enter the arena of European politics in order to stop the Europe that we love and for which we are ready to make major sacrifices, climbing to the next step towards self-immolation. We shall oppose the mandatory quotas, stand up for Christian culture, and fight to defend borders. And just taking like few notes on migration and understanding the change that has happened in the meantime, then stabilitocracy, or and just in addition, looking at the plans of the Austrian government for the EU presidency, which I mean Austria is going to take up at the beginning of July 2018, and the only and solely topic will be basically how to secure the borders of Schengen and of the European Union, how to fight migration. This will be the message to the Western Balkans. So basically, when you look at this very fundamental change of discourse, and I would love then tomorrow, today afternoon, to go a bit more deeper into the complexity, then basically the stabilitocracy is the only answer that can be offered right now. So there is no other, and this is basically then just mixing up all the plans in terms of Macedonia, solving the name issue, and wherever I take. And as it is so funny, before the lunch, just to conclude with Orban, just a few sentences, like another quote, just two more quotes, and then I'm going to end. So if we want to decide what Hungarians can aspire to in the world, we must not ignore our size. This is not Vucic speaking, but this is Orban speaking. Over the past 1,100 years, this has continually changed, but we have never been among the world's most populous nations. The situation today is that Hungarians account for 0.2% of the total world population. From this it clearly follows that the survival of Hungarians as a nation is not automatic. Hungarian policy should be predicated on the possibility that we could disappear, we could be dispersed, we could become extinct, and the world could go on without the species of Homo sapiens known as the Hungarians, or Serbs and Macedonians. Survival is a question of life force, and therefore the Hungarian state and the Hungarian government of today must be stable, strong, and ready to take action. This takes priority over everything. This supersedes all else. And then Christianity, and you put whatever you want. So, I mean, if you have that at the core of a discourse, and Kurz and AfD and all these guys are just at the same line, on the same page, you see basically that there is a tremendous change of what Europe and Europeanness is ongoing, and it starts from economic contempt, and issues related to capitalist production. But I will just stop here and continue reading Orban in the meantime, because this is so funny.
Thank you, Vedran, and then we will try to.
Okay, so two questions were directed to me.
Yes.
But first, to continue where Vedran practically stopped, which is a quote by a former Social Democrat MP, which is a colleague of mine at the faculty, saying that the answer to these questions might be that the political left sometimes doesn't have the ability to address something that's very important, and these guys that you mentioned do, and that's fear. That's fear, political fears of the populace. And she, my colleague, she's a very pronounced feminist, sees this as a problem, you know, because the political left stopped addressing fears of people. It might be part of the solution why it leaves political maneuvering space for other options. As for the two questions directed to me, what Professor Jovic said on the referendum probably takes us back to antiquity, where Plato hated democracy and Aristotle was quite skeptic about it. exactly because of populist aspects. What they really criticized in their work is the populist aspect of democracy. So basically it's what comes as a boomerang. But I think that nobody more than Jean-Jacques Rousseau is turning in his grave when he sees the clash of the two concepts of volonté de tout and volonté générale, seen as some common rationality of societies in Southeast Europe, and they're on certain issues and in certain countries in a grave clash, these two concepts, I would say. As for the second, so referendum is a bad idea, to cut it down, to narrow it. If it comes to the name dispute, referendum in Greece will most certainly fail, and in Macedonia possibly fail. So basically, if it comes to a referendum, we're roasted. So I don't think that this dead bird will fly. Both prime ministers promised a referendum. Whether they can get out of it, I don't know at this moment. We need to pass phase 1 and then see what happens. As for the second questions, this isn't very ambiguous. It's not the question that is ambiguous, the situation is ambiguous. There was a doctoral candidate the other day that was defending part of the PhD, this seminar work, and I said, please do not fall into one trap. If you want to speak about minority rights, first you have to define ethnic groups in Macedonia. If you follow Kapatortis' definition, then ethnic Albanians are a minority in Macedonia. If you follow the language of the Ohrid Framework Agreement, that they're not. So basically there is an unresolved ambiguity. Macedonia is a complex system of Horovician and Liphartian, some call it a consociational democracy. It's not a fully consociational democracy, that's wrong. There are many aspects of the integrative model of Horowitz. So basically, from the perspective of the long languages, which is the burning issue at hand, the long languages was, the main problem with the long languages, according to me, was 4 problems. And I will just refer to 2. The content, which was disputed by the political right, because for the political right and generally for the political right energy, giving rights to minority/ethnic groups equals disintegration of the state. The second issue was constitutionality of the law. I also expressed certain reserves on the constitutionality of how things were defined, not per se on the rights of the use of languages in the Macedonian context. And 3, it was compromised by adopting the law in a completely faulty procedure. The procedure of the parliament was breached, and it was breached flagrantly, which compromised the law and its content. So basically, but the law languages doesn't really substantially change what the Ohrid Framework Agreement defined in the state. You know, the political right wants to make a drama over it. You know how it's now Macedonia is bilingual and it's the end of the world, and it's probably end of the world as we know it. So, but it's not. However, the procedure was not good. So basically it complicates, and now this has been even more polarizing question regarding compared to the name dispute, because you need to satisfy also the needs of the political right-wingers of VMRO DPMNE, so you can have them aboard when certain questions that require 2/3 majority need to be voted in the parliament. And now they have the political leverage to say, listen, we don't want to be aboard because you breached the parliamentary procedure, you didn't take our amendments, it was 15,000 amendments by the way, in consideration, and you ignored President Ivanov's amendments as well, and objections to the law, which was definitely done. The Speaker of the Parliament quoted completely wrong articles of the manual of the rules of procedure of the Assembly. He deliberately quoted a completely wrong article. So basically it's complicating the situation, but substantially then it's going to be on the long run, unless these disintegrative processes that I was speaking about start, a combination of consociational and majoritarian democracy, some kind of balance. It's a very specific and unique system, I would say.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a great discussion. I think we could continue really here, but let's stop. Let's make a break, lunch break, and